before having consent of all participants of our talk. Today we will speak about narrative niche construction and memory ecologies, distributed narrative identity. Keynote speaker is Dr. Rичард Хеерсминк. Yeah, am I right? Hеерсминк?
Yeah, that's right. That's good. Yeah.
Okay. He's still affiliated with Monash University. Yeah, he's a lecturer in Monash. So he's also well known for his works on virtue epistemology and digital devices. Also very provocative talk. And a couple of words about schedule of our discussion. Rичард will have around 30 or 40 minutes for keynote presentation, keynote talk. Then we will have 15 minutes for clarifying questions and for questions about the keynote talk. And then a couple of us will have some small presentations. Sergei Sokolovsky and Elena Trufanova will have 10 minutes for their talks, like opposing or additional talk for your keynote speech. And then Rичард will have possibility to answer all the questions and all opposing points. And then we will have around 10 minutes or 15 minutes for our final discussion. So if you don't have any questions about schedule, so I think I will give the word to Rичард. So Rичарd, you are welcome, please.
Yeah, thanks for the invitation. So I'm trying to share my screen to show you my PowerPoint, and it says host disabled participant screen sharing. So I think you have to somehow activate that I can share my screen.
Just a second.
Sophia, it's a like green button. Green button. Share screen and then Внизу демонстрация экрана.
Да, я вижу, но
нажимаешь.
Безопасности.
Can you share now?
Yeah, I'll see. Yes, it works. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, share. So I'm gonna. Can you see my my screen?
Yeah, we are waiting for it, but I think possibly we will be able.
It's kind of strange because I only see my PowerPoint. Oh wait, what does this say? Hold control. Okay, right.
Oh,
is this better?
Yeah.
It's okay.
Participants cannot see it. Yeah, good. Okay, so I'm gonna maximize it now. Let me see if that works. It does not work. Okay, I'm gonna try it differently. Slideshow from beginning. Oh no. It's kind of ironic. I'm a philosopher of technology and I still can't get this stuff to work. Here we go. I think it works. It doesn't. It does, I think. Yeah, I think now it all works.
Yeah.
And so I'm gonna, okay. So I'm gonna present a paper. Sergey asked me to specifically present this paper. It's called Narrative Niche Construction, Memory Ecologies, and Distributed Narrative Identities. The paper is published in a journal called Biology and Philosophy somewhere last year, I think, in early last year. And it's part of a bigger project that I've been working on, in which I try to kind of argue that our narrative identity isn't something that is just stored in the brain or associated to our body, but is extended into or distributed across embodied agents like me and some of the artifacts and people in the environments that I'm interacting with. So for those of you who are familiar, I'm kind of applying an extended mind type perspective to the narrative self. And I'm arguing that the narrative self is something that also extends into the world. Now I got a bunch of papers. Oh, let me see if I can get to the next slide. Yeah. Is this working? Yeah, it is working. All right. So on the left-hand side, you see a screenshot of the paper. And on the right-hand side, you see a screenshot of a paper that is sort of similar. I make sort of similar claims in it, but it's not about narrative identity, but about cultural identity. And there too, I apply a niche construction view to better understanding our cultural identity. So it's kind of similar in approach. So if you find the paper on your left-hand side kind of interesting or helpful, maybe the paper on the right-hand side might be helpful too. Okay, outline three points that I want to make basically. So first I'll start by arguing or explaining what our memory ecology is, which are all the objects and people in our environments that we use to help us remember our personal past. I'll explain that in much more detail as we go along. And I'll also make the point that our memories aren't just stored in our brain, although some memories are stored in the brain, but not all. Sometimes we interact with an artifact or with a person, and the memory is kind of the result of the interaction rather than just the information in the brain. Then I'll move on to kind of arguing that our identity and self have a narrative structure. So who I am, what makes me me is my narrative, my autobiographical narrative. And then I'm gonna argue or gonna conceptualize how exactly is it that we interact with objects and people in our memory ecology as to construct our narrative identity. So how exactly do I use objects like photos and souvenirs and computers and other things in my environment and other people in my environments to help me construct my narrative identity? Okay, so first, memory ecologies. A very important components of our overall memory ecologies are evocative objects, is a concept kind of put forward by Sherry Turkle in a book she edited in 2007. And an evocative object is an object that when you interact with it, it makes you think about your personal past, right? So it kind of triggers or helps you reconstruct a memory of a thing that you've experienced in the past. So in the book, lots of different chapters written by different people, and every person, every contributor kind of reflects on that person's favorite evocative object. So this person talking about a car, about a suitcase, about a cello, a radio, a painting, an analog camera, a raincoat, glucometer, and many more objects. But what all these objects have in common is that they are kind of singular physical things that you can kind of interact with, basically. I think that's on the right track, but I want the concept of an evocative object to be a bit more broader. So I want to have a more inclusive concept of evocative objects. So I want to include any products of human agency that has evocative powers. So smells, for example, perfumes might trigger memories. Smell is a very strong kind of sensory input that can trigger memories, right? I think we've all experienced that the smell can kind of transport you back to some kind of event you've had in your childhood, for example. A song might do this, a snippet from a film, a story, a building like a church, or larger built structures like, I don't know, city squares or bigger things than cars and raincoats and cellos and so on. I think even spaces like a city square or an airport or a restaurant are autobiographically meaningful. So sometimes you go to a place that you've been to before, say you went to Venice 5 years ago, and you go again and you go to the same city square and all the memories come flooding back to the last time you were there. So what I want to make, the point that I want to make here is that it's not just singular physical objects that trigger autobiographical memories, but other things as well, like smells and churches and airports and entire spaces, perhaps even. Now, a particularly interesting kind of evocative objects are life logging or self-tracking technology. This is kind of 21st century evocative objects, and I'm sure you've all seen people with Fitbits and with other kinds of sensors, wearable sensors that detect all kinds of information about your past activity. So this kind of stuff, these kinds of gadgets and software systems and smartphones allow you to create an elaborate and detailed, sorry, I want to read from the slide, this doesn't make sense. It allows you to create an elaborate and detailed database about your life, which is referred to as a life log, right? This might contain GPS locations, emails, text messages, photos you take, videos you take, descriptions like journal descriptions of things that you've experienced, sleep patterns, what you eat, who you talk to, your heart rate, all kinds of variables can be uploaded into your life log. So particularly interesting kind of life logging technology are sense cams. So this is developed by Microsoft originally in 2007, I think. See it on your left-hand side. So it's a little device that you wear around your neck with a lanyard. It has a wide-angle camera, and it has sensors that detect your GPS location and light intensity. So every time you move to a different room or a different place, the light intensity changes or your GPS location changes, and the device takes a picture. It also has a button. You can push the button and it takes a picture automatically. And this is now kind of becoming more popular and also used by people, kind of younger, cognitively healthy people on your right-hand side. And it's interesting to point out here, I think this is originally designed for people who have dementia and amnesia and other kind of memory problems. So it's originally designed as an assistive technology to help people remember their personal past. But now it's kind of popularized and everybody, or not everybody, but a lot of people are using it now. So this is what that looks like. At the end of the day, you have many photos. So the device sometimes takes 100 pictures. Most of them are irrelevant, so you have to delete some of them and you have to edit some of them in order to make it relevant. I think this might be a life log of an academic because it's a person who sits a lot behind his or her computer. I think maybe 80% of these pictures are of a computer screen, so it doesn't have a very adventurous life, but it could be an academic. And on your left, the bottom left, you see a map, and at every point, I think, corresponds to the location of where the photo was taken. So you can see the picture itself, and also you can see where it is taken. Okay, now why do humans use evocative objects? What is it about these objects that makes it interesting or helpful for us to use at all? I think this has to do with the nature of biological memory, particularly the traces in our brain, in our biological brain that store or realize the memory. And so I think the contents and the valences of episodic memories, of our memories of episodes that we've had in the past, change over time, right? So detail is lost, and every time a memory is retrieved, it is reconstructed and restored with a slightly different content. So I'm sure this is familiar to all of us. You know that the deeper a memory is in your past, the longer ago it happens, the more likely it is that you don't really remember the details very well. So when you remember something that happened yesterday, it's very kind of clearly in mind and it's very vivid. But as time passes, chances are that a lot of information in the memory is lost, basically. This has to do, I think, with the connectionist nature of memory. I won't really go into connectionism, but very briefly, the connection weights between the units, between the neurons in your brain, store the content of the memory trace. And over time, the connection weights can be weakened, right? It's a biological system, right? It's not kind of static, it changes, it's kind of dynamic. And as a result of the weakening of these connections between the neurons, some of the content of the memory trace may be lost. Now, why do I point this out? I point this out because this is the reason why a lot of people are interested in life logging and evocative objects. Because biological memory is malleable and changes over time, we need the informational stability provided by artifacts like photos and videos to reliably remember our past, right? I can, of course, when I want to remember my past, just rely on my biological memory, and I often do, right? I just remember facts and experiences from my biological memory. But if I want to remember my past reliably and accurately and elaborately, it makes a lot of sense to rely on photos and videos and descriptions and souvenirs and all kinds of things, books, all kinds of objects that trigger memories, because biological memory is kind of weak and changes over time, and sometimes it's even unreliable. So the external components to biological memory provides the reliability and detail that the biological memory trace lacks. Now, I talked a lot about artifacts and evocative objects, and I am kind of a philosopher of technology by training. That is kind of my first degree was in philosophy of technology. So I have an interest in technology, but I have to emphasize also that it's not just artifacts that, can you still hear me? Sorry. Let me see. I found something. Is something still there? Can you still hear me? Or yeah, I couldn't see your face.
Yeah.
Okay, good. Sorry.
I
I couldn't see the faces anymore. So something is. I'm gonna start from current slide. So okay, yeah, transacted memory. Yeah, it works. Thank you. So this is a theory developed in social psychology by the late Daniel Wagner, psychologist at Harvard, I believe, and he was interested in how the memory systems of two people, or sometimes more than two people, are kind of interwoven and depend on each other to remember facts and personal experiences. Something that my PhD supervisor, John Sutton in Sydney, had and has an interest in as well. So here's an example from his work where a long married couple tries to remember the name of the show they saw on their honeymoon more than 40 years ago. Right, so it's a long period of time ago. Most chances are you forget stuff like this, right? So it's kind of just a detail, it's not super important. And if you would ask the individual member, so the wife and the husband, what's the name of the show you saw on your honeymoon, they wouldn't be able to tell you that. But if you put them together, they are able to generate or to create that memory together. So here's a little dialogue. I'll quickly read that to you. So wife starts by saying, and we went to 2 shows. Can you remember what they were called? Husband says, we did. One was a musical. Or were they both? I don't. No. One. Wife says, John Hanson was in it. Husband says, Desert Song. Wife says, Desert Song, that's it. I couldn't remember what it was called, but yes, I knew John Hanson was in it. Husband says, yes. So what I think happens here is that information in 2 different embodied brains are integrated through interactive cueing. So the wife and husband, they prompt each other, they give each other kind of cues or hints that helps them to kind of search their memory, I guess, internally, and then articulate that, and then that's kind of then input to the system of the other person in the diet. So what happens here is you cannot understand memory if you would just look at the individual brains. So that doesn't give the whole story. Here we need to understand, I think, that memory is an emergence group level property that you cannot reduce to its individual components. And so the memory system is kind of extended or distributed across these 2 people. That's the point kind of transacted memory. And such systems exist in people who have been married for a long time, but also in families and sports teams, a group of colleagues, a group of friends, basically groups of people that have known each other for a relatively long period of time and have had shared experiences as well. So the more shared experiences the group has had, the more deeply the memory systems are integrated. Now, quick summary. Summarizing my first point here is I refer to the total fields of evocative objects and transactive memory partners as a memory ecology, right? So it's both artifactual or physical and social, going to build out of kind of objects and humans, I guess. So any environmental resource, either artifact or social resource involved in autobiographical remembering is part of our memory ecology and an exponence of autobiographical memory. So that's the first point that I want to make, basically. I'm now going to move on to kind of explaining very briefly, maybe 5 minutes or so, what narrative identity is. So Narrative identity is kind of one aspect of who we are, I think. So I think identity is a complex thing, probably has many layers, but narrative identity is kind of one level of analysis, one level of abstraction, which says that our identity is constituted by our narrative. So what makes you the particular person you are, and what distinguishes you from other persons is your unique autobiographical narrative, right? So my life story, the total sum of all the experiences that I've had in the past, in an important way, kind of characterize who I am and distinguishes me from other people, basically. So there are other elements of identity, my moral views, my political views, my preferences for food and travel, like other things are also important for my identity, but I'm focusing on narrative identity because I think that's a really important component of what makes me me. Now, I'm drawing on the work of Maria Schachmann here. She's an American philosopher. She points out that narratives need to have three properties, or self-narratives, so narratives that make me me. So I'm not talking about literary narratives or cinematographic narratives. It's about personal narratives of human beings, basically. So first, the narrative needs to be mostly linear, right? So when I remember my past, I need to do so in an order in which the events actually happened. So it's kind of, makes kind of sense, I think, because my life is kind of a linear thing. And so the narrative needs to reflect that. So that's one. Two, a person needs to be able to articulate or think through the narrative. So when somebody asks you, who are you? You need to be able to kind of answer the question in various levels of detail, or you need to be able to just think it through in your head, right? So when you want to think, okay, who am I? What was my past like? You need to be able to kind of think through either linguistically or in images, the story of your life, basically. It needs to be available or accessible to you. And it has to be largely consistent with reality. So I'll get back to that point in the next slide, but it has to be largely true, right? Memory isn't perfect. So there are kind of minor, sometimes kind of major inconsistencies, I guess, in memories, but most of the time our narratives tell a story that is mostly true, right? So there are some things that are kind of inconsistent or false. That's fine. It doesn't have to be perfect, but it has to be kind of largely true. And then a final point that I think is important to mention, and this comes from Paul Ricoeur, this notion of employment, where our agency creates meaningful causal connections between the building blocks of the narrative, which are autobiographical memories. So narrative, we have lots of separate memories, right? But employment makes these memories into an integrated and a coherent and a consistent whole, right? If you don't implot, you just have a number of separate memories, but employment is the kind of the glue that keeps all these memories together. And narratives have a function, I think. There's a good reason why we have these narratives, because it provides coherence to our temporal existence, right? Humans exist 70, 80 years most of the time. That's a long period of time, and we have many experiences in that time frame. And having a narrative allows you to see your life as an unfolding trajectory or as an unfolding story. So the narrative allows me to understand my past, that the past has led to the present, and that the past and the present will lead to some kind of future events as well. So the narrative memory allows us to see kind of the story of our life, because it was an unfolding project. Now, one final example that I want to mention here is a case study from Oliver Sacks. Oliver Sacks is a neurologist from England originally, but most of his work in New York, I think. He has a book, there's many books actually, but one of his books is called The Man Who Mistook His Wife for a Hat. It's a famous book. And in it, every chapter is a case study of a different patient. One of his patients is Mr. Thompson, and he has Korsakoff syndrome. So he drank too much, and the alcohol destroyed his narrative and autobiographical memory. So Mr. Thompson cannot tell you his life story. When you ask him who he is, he makes up a story. He confabulates a micro narrative. So one example that Oliver Sacks gives, because Oliver Sacks is a neurologist, he's wearing a white coat. He enters the room of Mr. Thompson. Mr. Thompson is confused. He looks at Oliver Sacks. He thinks, okay, what is this situation? What am I doing here? Well, he's wearing a white coat. He must be a butcher. If he's a butcher, I am a customer in a butcher shop. And then he starts talking about meat and blood and that kind of stuff. And the point here is that these kind of confabulated narratives aren't identity constituting, right? They aren't really what Mr. Thompson is. They're just made up stories that he uses to kind of make sense of the environment. So he doesn't have proper narrative identity. He might have what some people call the minimal self, which is the capacity that we have to have subjective experience, right? So subjectivity, he still has, probably it is something it is like to be Mr. Thompson, but he doesn't have narrative identity anymore. It's a very tragic case. It needs to be taken care of always. Okay, right. Now I'm gonna make this clear. This is my arguments, right? So I'm a philosopher, so I like argument structures. This is kind of the formal structure of my arguments. It goes like this. 3 premises and a conclusion. First premise, human selves have a narrative structure which is realized by autobiographical memories. That's the last 5 minutes, basically, right? So in one way, I am my life story, or my life story is kind of shapes me in an important way. Some of our autobiographical memories are distributed across embodied brains interacting with their memory ecology, right? So the claim, the idea here is that my memories aren't stored just in the brain. Some memories are, or some components of memories are, but my memories are also extended into or distributed across my embodied agents and artifacts in the environment and transactive memory partners. That's the idea. So it's kind of an extended mind view on autobiographical memory. Premise 3 is more technical, but if human selves have a narrative structure realized by autobiographical memories, and if some of our autobiographical memories are distributed, then human selves are also distributed. And the conclusion here is that human narrative selves are sometimes distributed structures, right? So the point here, the take-home message is kind of my narrative identity isn't something that is only kind of stored or realized in my embodied brain, but it heavily depends on artifacts and other people in my environments. Okay, so that's the first, those are the first 2 components, I guess, 2 statements that I want to make. I'm now going to move into narrative niche construction. So I'm going to use a narrative niche construction approach to better understand how we construct our memory ecology. Now, niche construction theory is a theory, it's a relatively new theory in evolutionary biology, and it emphasizes the importance of cultural activities for evolutionary processes. So traditionally, evolutionary theory is all about genetics. How do I pass on my genes to the next generation, et cetera, et cetera. That is, if you are a niche construction theorist, too one-dimensional. That's not the whole story, because there's more to it than merely the passing on of genes. Namely, the environment plays a very important role in kind of evolution and inheritance systems as well. Not just humans, right? Animals do it too. So a bunch of examples here. Spiders create webs, beavers build dams, birds make nests, moles dig burrows, and termites build mounds. So there's a lot of examples in the animal kingdom of animals that use tools to change the environments. And by doing so, that gives them kind of a benefit, basically. It makes finding food easier, it gives them protection against the elements or against other animals or something. And so the point here is that organisms don't merely adapt to the environment, they also adapt the environment to us, right? Sure, we evolve traits in relation to selection pressures in the environment. That's one part of the story, but the other part is that we sometimes change the environment. Rather than changing us, we change the environment by using tools, by constructing a niche, basically. So here there are 2 inheritance channels. One is genetic and biological, I guess, and the other one is more socio-cultural, technological, right? So genetic and the socio-cultural world are the things that are relevant for organisms, basically. Now, humans are interesting here because we don't just alter our physical environments, but also our informational and our cognitive environments. right? So yes, humans also engage in kind of physical, practical niche construction, which is glasses and cars and chairs and so on. But we also developed number systems, maps, cartographic systems, diagrams, symbols, alphabets, and languages, as well as technologies to store that information, like clay tablets in the old days, papyrus scrolls in the old days too. But now we have books and newspapers, abacuses, computers, and of course, more recently, we got the internet. So we have a lot of kinds of informational systems and technologies that store and manipulate that information. And we use that information to perform our cognitive tasks, right? So we are, I think maybe, I'm not sure if this is too bold a claim, but I think using information in the environment, using cognitive tools to perform cognitive tasks might be, I think, a uniquely human form of tool use. But of course, it's not just tools in the environment, right? It is also other people that are really important. So our niche is artifacts and artifactual, but also other people, of course. So there's something called social learning, where you learn information and skills from others in your community. It's a very common thing. And one final thing that I want to point out is this feature of niche construction activities are cumulative. So I think Kim Sterelny calls this downstream niche construction, where my generation basically makes some kind of a technology artifact system, and that is then passed on to the next generation. So my offspring, my kids will use that technology, they will improve it, they will pass it on to their kids, etc., etc. So technology is as a cumulative aspect, right? So we keep changing the informational technologies that our parents' generation have made. And that has been going on for like thousands and thousands of years. So we keep improving cognitive technology, basically. Now, let us move on to narrative niche construction. So how is that theoretical apparatus of niche construction helpful for better understanding how we interact with our memory ecology? Now, narrative niche construction, or narrative engineering, as I also call it in the paper, I can define that as intentionally altering and utilizing the environments for aiding us in remembering our personal past, right? So when I use an artifact, an object, when I talk to my transactive memory partners, that is kind of a form of niche construction. Now, I identified three types of processes here: creating, editing, and using. I'll talk you through these in the next couple of minutes. Creating is making an evocative object with the intention to use it later for retrieving and constructing a memory. So examples here are taking a photo, making a video on your phone, buying a souvenir, writing an entry in your journal and your diary, with the intention then to later interact with that so that you can construct your past in a better way. Or making your life log, for example, would be a good example as well. This happens frequently, I think. It's a very common human activity, but with evocative objects, sometimes associations between the objects and a memory are formed unintentionally. So an example I give in the paper is a musician who plays a show in Sydney Opera House. He's a cellist and was really proud of the shows he gave. And the cello that he has, every time she looks at it, triggers memories of the event, of the show that she gave. And because of that unintentionally formed association between the cello and the memory, it can then later be used actively as an evocative object. So that person could put the cello in a room, for example, because she wants to be reminded of the show that she played at the Sydney Opera House. So once these unintendedly formed associations are made, we can use the artifacts for helping us to remember our past. Okay, moving on. Now, editing, I define this as intentionally changing the pre-existing informational composition of one's memory ecology. Bunch of examples again. So you might remove an evocative object, you might delete a photo or video, you might put an evocative object in a box in the garage because you no longer want to be reminded of the memory that it triggers. So you might have a picture of you and your ex-girlfriend or ex-boyfriend in your living room, you break up with him or her, and you put the photo in a box in the garage because you don't want to be reminded of that person constantly. Life logs too, very frequently edited because there's lots of photos in there that you don't need. They're out of focus, or you got duplicates of photos. So live logging is something that often involves editing the content of your live log. More radical forms of editing, I think, are moving to a new house after a loved one passed away, as to not be reminded of that person, right? So you might have spent a lot of time together with your partner in a particular house. Your partner might pass away, and the house is full with objects, and the house itself, right? Your embodied presence in the house reminds you of the person. You don't want to be reminded of that person, so you move away to a different place, basically. That too, I think, is a form of editing. Now, using last kind of process is intentionally interacting with an evocative object or a transacted memory partner for the purpose of retrieving and constructing an autobiographical memory. This is very common, right? The key point here is that it has to be intentional, right? So when you use an evocative object or a transacted memory partner, you do it intentionally. Examples, again, so you might browse through the photos on your smartphone or your computer, or you might get like old school style and analog paper-based photo album. Some people still have those out of the cupboard, and you might start browsing through it. You might visit a place that you've been to before. You might put up some music that reminds you of some past event, of a concert that you visited. You might wear a piece of jewelry, a ring, say, on your hand. A wedding ring often is there because it reminds you of the person that you're married to. You might interact with your life log, with your diary, all with the intention. You do this for the reason because you want to evoke a personal memory. Now, this is very common. I think we do this all the time. But an interesting feature here is also that sometimes memories are unintentionally retrieved when interacting with an object or person. So, for example, I might turn on the TV here. I might watch a cooking program of a person who's traveling through Venice, say. I've been to Venice a couple of years ago, and doing that might trigger all kinds of memories of when I was in Venice, right? I didn't turn on the TV with the intention to watch the show and to trigger all these memories, but it happens anyway. I think this is very common. I think this happens all the time, where you look at an object or you talk to a person and some kind of memory comes flooding back into your consciousness, but it's not using. Because using, the way I define it, is intentionally interacting with an object. And so if it happens accidentally, it's not intentionally, and it can't be classified as using. That doesn't mean, though, that we shouldn't kind of include these unintentionally retrieved memories in our theories. I just don't characterize them as using, because using, I think, has this intentional component to it. Okay, this is the last concept that I want to present to you, which is this notion of downstream narrative niche construction. So I think this happens when evocative objects and family stories are passed on from one generation to the next. Here's an example from the literature on human-computer interaction, where a person inherits a box of all kinds of objects from her mother. And this is what she says about it. This was given to me by my mom last Christmas. She picked up all sorts of lovely little family treasures, pictures of my great-grandparents, my great-grandmother's sewing kit, my great-uncle's wooden carvings, and all sorts of old family things. It's like a little corner of part of my life. So this is where evocative objects are transferred from one generation to the next, so that these objects then become kind of meaningful to the new person who inherits them. This is quite common. I think many people inherit physical objects from their parents. And sometimes those objects might be inherited by their parents from their parents. So the trajectory here is sometimes a couple of generations, but not many generations. I think maybe 3 or 4 generations is kind of the limit here. And it also happens socially. So it's not just technology that is transferred from one generation to the next. It's also kind of family stories, right? You inherit these from your parents, from your grandparents, from other family members as well. Here's an example where a mother and a son are talking about the past of that son. So John here is, I think, maybe 8 or 10 years old. And humans have this feature called childhood amnesia. So we have very little memories of what happened to us before we were 4 years old. almost no memories basically, and maybe 1 or 2 memories of what happened to us before we were 10 years old. So it's called childhood amnesia. And so John is young, he doesn't remember most of his past, but his mother does. So his mother does remember his past experiences. And so the mother, in a way, tells John the experiences that he himself had, but can't remember anymore. So I quickly read this dialogue to you. It's kind of funny. John starts by, I was born in the Holy Cross Hospital in Weinheim, this place in Germany. What happened then, Mom? Mother says, yes, then you were born. John says, yeah. Then we went home. That was the first 2 years. You don't know. John says, yeah. Then we were still living at Grants the first 3 months. And as our flat wasn't ready yet, you can't remember that. John says, yeah. Then we moved with you to the flat in B, a place in Germany, I think. Dad, you, and me. And then we lived there for a while. John says, and then you split up, Mother. Right, John. And then, Mom, what happened then? Mother says, perhaps we should tell a little bit about what it was like while we were living together that you can't really remember, John. John says, yeah, that was when what was that like? Mother says, yeah, I got my training. I got it quite early and we were pretty young. So this happens in the psychology laboratory. So it's a little bit incoherent, right? So it's this little kid talking to his mom. But the point here is that John can't remember most of what happened before he was 10, but his mother can, and his mother remembers for him, basically. So this is kind of an intergenerational transactive memory system where the mother remembers John's events for him. So it's kind of passed on from one generation to the next. Okay, so I'm going to conclude this by last slide. So one of the things that I said in the beginning is that our self has a narrative structure, right? Who I am, what makes me me is my autobiographical narrative, my life story, built up from specific autobiographical memories. These memories aren't just stored in the brain, but are distributed across me, my brain, my body, and objects and other people in my environment. That's the distributed narrative self-view that I've been working on for the last couple of years. And then I identified 3 types of niche construction processes that govern how we interact and create and use and edit our memory ecology. And I've also mentioned this notion of downstream narrative construction. That was my talk. Thank you very much for your attention. I'm gonna...
yeah, thank you, Richard, for your brilliant presentation. So I
see all your faces now. Sorry, I couldn't see your faces during my presentation. Actually, somehow my settings were different. So I'm gonna... Yeah, and I see all of you again. Thank you.
Yeah, we saw you, and each of us could see the faces, but sorry that you couldn't.
No, that's that's my fault.
So I open the floor for clarifying questions and maybe some short comments, short cues. So, do you have any questions? You can switch on the microphone and ask. So please.
May I?
Yeah, please.
The point about editing. I wonder whether you think of connecting this editing to identity politics.
All right.
Yeah.
Right.
That's my question.
Yeah, gosh. So the thing, so my focus, I've had this, it's not necessarily criticism, but the focus of my theories and conceptual kind of analysis is kind of a person, like a single person, and the environment. So I look at kind of, it's person-centered, I guess. I don't really have a lot to say about group identity, for example, or identity politics. It's not quite, I think the link can be made. I think definitely there is a link there that you can make between editing, kind of changing the composition of the informational composition of your memory ecology. But I think it's kind of done mostly by the individual, by the person, him or herself. I'm not sure, how would you identify or define identity politics? Maybe I can.
Yes, the reason I ask the question is, for me, politics is part of ecology. and as well as affective states, which you mentioned in the article, right very little. So the picture gets somehow reduced of the total ecology of our action as agents. That's why I asked.
Yeah, okay. I think maybe this sounds a bit strange, perhaps, I guess, but the other paper that I mentioned, the one on cultural identity and artifacts, kind of doesn't talk quite about identity politics, but it's much more related to the things that you just said. So, because I think narrative identity is kind of is an individual thing, right? It's my narrative, and it's my narrative only. Cultural identity is a higher, I'm not sure if it's a higher level category, but I identify with being Australian, for example, and with being Dutch and being male and being philosopher, right? All kinds of social categories that I identify with and that make up my cultural identity. And their artifacts too are important. So monuments, for example, are really important to remember the historical past of Australia, right? So I live very close to, it's called the Shrine of Remembrance, which is where the Australians go to when they want to remember all the wars that they've fought in. And so their monuments play a role in the way we remember the past of the cultural groups that we identify with. I think that's a very similar kind of thing as the way we remember our narrative, right, by interacting with artifacts. So my narrative identity is remembered through interacting with artifacts and other people, but my cultural identity, the history of the social groups that I identify with, is also remembered through interacting with artifacts, like history books, monuments, but also kind of practices that we do, maybe clothes that we wear. And there, I think the political side plays a much bigger role, because who decides what kinds of things do we remember about the past? So which wars do we remember? How do we remember the wars? What kind of information do we include in archives and in museums, right? Et cetera, et cetera. And there, that has a much stronger political component, I think. And then you had a comment about effective states as well. So do you want me to speak to that as well? Or should I maybe?
Yeah.
So effective states, right? It's a good question, actually, I think. I didn't say much about that, but affect and emotion play an important role in remembering, I think. I think when I remember my personal past, it is not a neutral image or vision that comes to me. Sometimes, or quite often, when I remember my past, it is very kind of emotionally or affectively important for me. So I think memories and memory states and affective states are often intertwined when I remember my personal past, right? So I didn't want to give the impression that the memory is just retrieving information and just factual information about my past. Although maybe in this paper, I might have not said anything about affect, but in many other papers, there's a lot of stuff on affect and how affect is influenced by artifacts and by other people. That's a very important aspect of my overall view of how we interact with artifacts. Yes.
Okay, thank you, Richard. We have some other couple of questions. So please, Dr. Olga Popova, please, you're welcome.
Okay, thank you, Richard. Thank you for your report. You are talking about the ecology of memory, but don't you think that since our memory is a distributed system where all the garbage goes, we need to talk about memory pollution? And what laws would you propose to support the ecology of memory without allowing it to be polluted?
Oh, that's a very good question. Yeah.
And the second question is very close to it. Did I understand correctly that it is primarily about editing our memories so that memories do not cause pain? How then to be with a historical memory?
That's a good point. Good questions. Yeah, so so they're related questions, I think. Memory pollution, did you say? Memory ecology pollution, or did you say population?
Pollution, yes.
Yeah, right, it was pollution, yeah, right. So, yeah, I guess this is very personal, right? Some people have many evocative objects in their houses. So some people have collections of stamps and beer bottles and books and they're just the kind of people who wants to be reminded of their past quite often. Other people have houses that are very minimal, right? So there's now this trend called minimalism. Marie Kondo, I'm not sure if you've heard of her, who says you basically clean out your whole house. You don't want to have a cluttered house because it's messy. It's not good for your thoughts if you have all these objects. It's not, I mean, I don't think we can propose laws. I think you mentioned laws. I don't think laws work here. I think it's a very personal thing. I might have hundreds of photos and souvenirs of all the holidays that I went to, and I want to be reminded of them constantly. And other people don't, I think. It's just a very idiosyncratic personal type thing. And it also changes over time, I think. So let's say you are in the middle of a relationship, you go with your partner on holiday, you take many photos and you put those photos in your apartment, but you might break up with him or her, and then you don't want to see those photos anymore, right? So you don't want to be reminded of that person because it's very painful. It ties into Sergei's question about affect as well, but memory is very often has a very strong affective component, I think. So there's no laws, I think, that govern it. It's super personal. It depends on the person, and it also depends on your life phase. So sometimes you want to be reminded of events that happened in your childhood, maybe not so when you grow up. Basically, when you get a few years older, you don't want to be reminded of things. It changes. It's a very dynamic thing, and that's also why I think people's living rooms change. Also, you have different books, different CDs, different souvenirs. You have different photos on your phone. You delete photos that you don't want to be reminded of anymore. It's a very personal thing. Pollution, yeah, I mean, cluttering, I don't know. I wouldn't maybe not say that it's pollution. It's just depends on the kind of memories that you would want to be reminded of. And only positive, nah, yeah, I guess again, that's a personal thing. I suppose overall people tend to be such that they do want to be reminded of personal events, right? This is why all our Facebook profiles only have pictures of holidays and birthday parties and stuff, right? You don't put pictures of funerals on your Facebook because you don't want to be reminded of funerals most of the time. Sometimes you do, but most of the time you curate, basically, right? You edit, you curate your memory ecology such that you present a particular, perhaps curated positive version of your past. I think that too happens quite often, and also depends on the individual. Some people do it more than others. I'm not quite sure if I answered your question correctly or adequately, but and maybe I can add one thing before privacy is important as well, because you don't always want to share your pictures or your souvenirs with other people, right? So sometimes it is just meant for you. You don't want other people to have access to your life log. And there's kind of a normative political component. I think only you should, and this is where laws, maybe like not laws of nature, but laws, normative laws, should govern who has access to your memory ecology, to your social media profiles, and to your life logs, right? So they should be protected, I think, against invasion from third parties. Okay.
Thank you, Richard. So we have another question from Dr. Liana Тухватулина, please.
Thank you, Richard, for your talk. I wonder if, based on what you said, can we make any normative claim? How to be a virtuous narrative niche constructor, how to be a virtuous user of your memory, and should we stay here on reliabilist version of virtue epistemology, if I may put it like this, or should we think more about responsibility? So maybe, sorry, I understand that it's a question for a bigger talk, but still maybe you have some thoughts about this. Thank you so much.
Well, it's a very good question, actually. And so you've done your homework and your reading. It's a very good question. Because virtuous, because with virtue epistemology, so I've done some work on virtue epistemology, as it relates to facts, like factual statements that you get from search engines, for example, or from Wikipedia. And so you can cultivate particular intellectual virtues that allow you to interact with the internet in a way that you can filter out the false information, like fake news, for example, and only use information that's true, right? I think that's a virtuous way of using kind of memory technologies as it relates to memories, semantic memories, basically, right? Memories of facts. So when did the Second World War end? When did the British invade Australia? That kind of stuff, right? And so there, because truth is really, really important with semantic memory, you need to get the facts right. With memory ecologies and autobiographical memory, I guess it's slightly different because, yeah, most of the time it is supposed to be true what you remember, but certainly not always. I think, I guess maybe this is also a personal thing. This might depend on the individual. Some people will have only kind of, how do I say this? Sorry, I'm getting a bit stuck here. Could you maybe kind of refresh me about the distinction about reliabilism and responsibilism in virtue epistemology? Because I think that distinction is important for what I want to answer here.
Reliabilism?
Yeah.
I think here it would be the accent on truth. You're pursuing truth in your memories, yeah. And for responsibilism, probably, I don't know, it's just my guess, but probably it's more about how you will use these memories, about their pragmatic aspect, probably. But
right.
It's just some intuition.
Yeah. It's a very good question. I think, like, because the Maria Schegman point was that, yeah, if the narrative is identity constituting, it must be largely true, right? So one thing that I can maybe mention, it's slightly off topic, but relevant. So if you have an Alzheimer's patient who doesn't remember his past anymore, and you then insert, or you tell that person events that didn't actually happen, you lie to that person, that would be unvirtuous, I think. It wouldn't be a virtuous type of thing to interfere with that person's photo albums, for example. That would be unvirtuous, I think. And virtuous then would be only to include objects, photos, descriptions, videos about events that really did happen, that are true and are consistent with that person's identity. I think that may be one way to tease out kind of the virtuous, unvirtuous way of using your life log. Yeah, it is something I need to think more about. I think it's a really good question, and it's something I have to put some more thought into.
Yeah, thank you, Richard. I have one more epistemological question. It is about memory distribution. So is co-reference necessary for this kind of distribution? So using your example about husband and wife's memory, so what would you say if a husband contaminates the singer, not John Hansen, but he means that another musical desert song and another singer, maybe Hans Johnson, but together they can realize the truth, but maybe each of them contaminates maybe singer or song or musical. So the truth is produced, but no one of them doesn't know exactly even the fact that they propose. So it is something like Gettiarization of this narrative memory distribution.
Yeah, and it happens. That's a good point. I think memory is unreliable. So certainly if you want to remember something that happened 40 years ago, right, your honeymoon, it's a long time, and maybe maybe they got it wrong. It might actually be wrong. They might be convinced that it's the name of the show of their song honeymoon, but it might actually be wrong, and that happens. I think ideally, I'm not quite sure what to say to this though, because I think from my perspective, from the individual, the very reason why we use artifacts and other people to remember our past is because it creates more reliability. right? I think certainly with technology and photos are very difficult not to contaminate your memory, right? So you just have a photo there and it happens, that's exactly a picture of how it happened, right? So it doesn't really contaminate your memory in the same way that another person might do, because that person also has a biological memory system, and biological memory is not perfect. So if you rely on your transactive memory partners, they might contaminate your memory with false information. And that happens, I think, maybe if it happens once in a while, it's not so much a problem, because I said in the beginning, right, narratives should be mostly true, right? So some memories are kind of inaccurate or not quite true. And that happens, that's perfectly normal, everybody has that. But if most of the narrative is false or confabulated, then it becomes a problem, right? So this is kind of a weird example. Think of Total Recall, right? The film with Arnold Schwarzenegger from the 80s. It's a science fiction film, but one of the main characters has an entire narrative implanted in his head about a life story that didn't happen to him, right? So it's made up, it's a story about somebody else's life, but he thinks it's true, but it's not true. It's not his life, it was somebody else's life. In that case, that's a problem. That's not a narrative that is identity constituting. But if we have, I don't know, a handful of dozen memories here and there that are contaminated, I think, yeah, that's just a normal part, I think, of transactive memory. That's just how biological memory works. Ideally, you prevent it, but I think it's very hard to prevent, because that's just how interactions with other people sometimes play out.
Okay, thank you, Richard, for your response. So, do we have any other questions? So, I think in the end of our talk, we will have time for more problematic comments and cues. So,
yeah.
Okay, so I would like to give the floor for something like opposing talk, if we can call it so. Give a floor for Sergei Sokolovsky. Please, Sergei, you have 10 minutes for your report.
Thank you, Sergei. I will need probably less time. I enjoyed reading the article, and the subject is fascinating for me, and the article is lucidly written. Most of its appeal lies in its rigorous argumentation, but some of its content depends on the underlying metaphors, which are either widely shared, borrowed from literature, and thus become taken for granted almost, or alternatively might be idiosyncratic, and some could be placed in the intermediate position between these two poles. Such is the metaphor of cognitive niche, which is a double metaphor, because in ecology it has been borrowed from architecture, and now it's borrowed in cognitive studies. Its intermediate position in the scale I have just suggested depends on its use not only by our today's interlocutor, but by a score of authors whose works are cited or noted in this article, in this paper. And I should like somewhat to extend this metaphor to find out what it means when ecological notions are imported and used in cognitive behavior studies and memory studies. Let's try to compare these two concepts. My comparison would not be exhaustive, just some hints. According to the recent edition of Encyclopedia of Ecology, I mean the 2 years ago, ecological niche is a term for the position of species within an ecosystem, describing both the range of conditions necessary for persistence of the species and its ecological role in the ecosystem. That's the definition.
Right, yeah.
It subsumes all the interactions between a species and their biotic and abiotic environments, and thus represents a fundamental ecological concept. The definition indicates that the concept of niche has two sides, which are not so tightly related. One concerns the effects environment has on a species, and the other, the effects a species has on the environment. So far, so good. In most of ecological thinking, however, both meanings are implicitly or explicitly mixed. The reason is that ecology is about interactions between populations, and if persistence of a species is determined by the presence of other species, food sources, competitors, predators, etc., all species are naturally both affected by the environment and at the same time affect the environment for other species. The concept of ecological niche was introduced, as anyone nowadays easily find out, not by Hutchinson in 1957 paper, as it is sometimes claimed, but 40 years earlier by American naturalist Joseph Greenwald, back in 1917. There are some additional technical concepts that augment or detail the definition of ecological niche. This is the concept of exploitative competition that refers to the competition over resources, as well as the concept of niche width that helps us understand a particular niche position towards other ecological niches. There are habitat requirements and niches function in the ecosystem, the concept of modes of species coexistence, etc. And how all these traits refer or could be applied within the metaphor of cognitive niche. The first contrast that draws at least my attention is that in memory ecology, the concept of niche is centered mostly, as you told in our discussion, on an individual. When in bioecology, it is on a species or population of one species in a particular habitat. In other words, biological niches are always sort of public niches, and not individual niches. Whereas in cognitive ecology, there are both types. Further, if in the metaphor of cognitive niche, we try to define the position of a species within ecosystem, then we'll need to situate memory among other human faculties in relation to their ecological entanglements. We'll need, for example, to see how memory ecology is different from, say, imagination ecology, which has its own environmental triggers, or how it is different from the ecology of effect. Of course, they may overlap. We might even presume that there is some competition and overlap between the species of memory, affect and imagination, as well as other cognitive abilities, insofar as memories are affective, imaginative, and rational. The resources for the narrative niche construction, as we know from this article, are neural or biological, interactional, and artifactual. But biological are viewed as internal to self, and the two remaining types as scaffolding or external. In our species, if our species are memories among other human faculties, or metaphorical species, affect, imagination, and the like, then all types of resources should be viewed at least conceptually external, forming the habitat or niche for memory and guaranteeing its subsistence. If self is treated as species in this metaphor, it should be of a different order from its faculties. And if it is construed as of the same order, then self competes with its memory for the same resources. They are in the situation of exploitative competition. The metaphor breaks here as this relationship between memory and self engineered by the metaphor does not make sense. Ecological niche is usually spatially compact, at least on a local scale. although the scale varies across different biological species. Landscape features, even in aquatic ecosystems, exert a great influence on niche boundaries. Narrative or cognitive niche need not be compact. The memory triggers could be dispersed and contingent, as in the famous case of Proustian Madeleine. We often do not know in advance, especially when we meet the trigger for the first time, that it will serve as a trigger for memories, for our memories. I will not follow further this line of commentary, but instead look at what Foucault suggested as silences, omissions, understatements of this otherwise quite illuminating text. I should perhaps mention that my interests during some 10 last years were with material semiotics and embodiment studies. So I became familiar with some of your work on distributed cognition earlier, and morality, back your article of 2016. In fact, which ironically I quite forgot. This unfortunate loss of memory.
That's what I say. Biological memory is unreliable, right?
Yeah, yeah.
There you go.
My failings memory then to the merits of that work. But back to Foucauldian suggestion. Also, if I look at the cases of artifactual memory you provide, I see instead of one type of triggers, at least two. One refers to various kinds of inscription, the notion that you don't use, sometimes mediated by language, as in the case of a notebook. Others are related to past events, either by association or via continuous existence of a particular artifact, inherited from parents, ancestors, or friends that a person knew, or from the places he or she visited. Now, mediatized inscriptions such as writing or photo, film, or video provide guidance enough that could restore even absent memories. That is, they could act as prosthetic memory devices, robust and durable in a number of situations, involving sometimes several or many persons, and effective in various emotional atmospheres. Not quite so in the case of associations, when a particular taste or smell, a landscape or weather feature remind us of other places and situations in the past. That is when they serve as memory triggers. So I presume we shall need to go further in comparing various cases of inscription and association to find out more about their roles as memory triggers or parts of memory ecology. And my concluding remark, I have tried with these comments to illuminate the seductions of any metaphor, as it is organizing our vision and provides a particular structure and pattern where they might be absent in reality. Metaphor is a part of implodement. What if we use for the same material another metaphor, borrowed from geology with its strata, or geography with its special distributions, or topology with its transformations, etc. At the same time, I should say that the metaphor cognitive niche remains appealing, and I will most probably use it in my own research of commemoration practices. Thank you.
Thank you, Sergey.
Thank you, sir. There's a lot there.
Richard, excuse me, can I ask you to switch off the screen demonstration if you don't mind, if you don't need it, so we can see on the whole screen each other and see the speaker?
Yeah. Absolutely. How do I turn this off?
Is
it still
green button in
on the bottom, yeah, of the screen.
Yeah,
so my whole Zoom looks different than it usually does, I have to say.
There is also a red button at the top of your presentations. Just stop sharing. Stop sharing.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah,
Oh, I couldn't do it, right? So that's
Yeah.
that's now I see it. So Sergio, you did this. Thank you. That's much appreciated. Now it looks like it usually looks. Yes. Okay.
Okay, that's great.
Cool.
So Richard, you have 5 minutes to respond, to react to Sergey's talk.
Wow. I mean, Sergey, there was a lot there. I'm not sure. I made a lot of notes here, right? As I am an extended mind theorist, that's I externalize my notes, my thoughts. So that's right. So you started with the notion of cognitive niche construction as a metaphor, and it's used in other fields as well, like ecology, right? So this notion of ecology, I think, comes from biology, as far as I'm aware. It's a whole field of study in biology. There's lots of people working in there. I'm not sure how strict you should take the phrase memory ecology as borrowing from biology. Yes, they both use the word ecology, but the way biologists use there's much more detail, there's much more conceptual repertoire, much more theory and empirical stuff in ecology as a field in biology. Memory ecology is kind of heuristically borrowing the phrase ecology. It doesn't really mean, my point is that I don't think it means exactly the same thing in my use of the word as it does in biology. That's not quite an answer to your point. It's just more like a clarification, I think. Yes, ecology is important. It's the environment in which we live in. I think the way that I use it originally comes from a theorist called Bateson. It's been a while since I've read him. I think the whole concept of memory, of cognitive ecology, is from Bateson from, I don't know, 1970s or maybe earlier. It's been picked up on by Edwin Hutchins. He's an anthropologist, a cognitive anthropologist. He wrote a paper in 2010 in a journal called Topics in Cognitive Science. The paper is called Cognitive Ecology. And he introduced that notion of cognitive ecology into extended mind theory, basically, right? Because an extended mind theorist, as I am too, has a bit of a narrow focus, right? It looks at one single person and one single artifact, and it looks at that particular relationship. But as Hutchins, being an anthropologist, points out, that is too narrow, right? Humans live in an entire environment, a memory or a cognitive ecology. It is not just one object. There's like a dozen in my living room, and when I go out, there's traffic signs and maps and billboards. There's lots of information in my environment that I use for cognitive purposes. So as a theorist, we shouldn't just look at single artifacts. We should, if you want to better understand the relation we have to artifacts, cast your net wider and look at the entire ecology. I think that's why that phrase cognitive ecology was introduced in the literature that I've been working with, namely extended mind literature, because extended mind is too narrow. You should look wider. You should broaden your view. And I see that I would appreciate if you could send me the written version of your commentary. I think there's a lot there. There was so much there that I couldn't process it all. One thing that I want to kind of point out, so ecology in biology is about the population level, right? It's about how populations in their entirety interact with other populations and with the ecology and with the niche, right? So it's a much higher level structure with many more entities on that level. I work what you can maybe call a micro niche, right? So macro niche works on population level. Micro ecology or micro niches are my personal niche, right? So my living room, all the books and my computer, my phone and my office and all the people I know, my wife, my friends, etc., right? So all the entities in my environment, either artifacts or human beings that are relevant for me personally, that is kind of a micro niche, I guess, and that has been my focus. But I take your point. It's a good point that if you want to do an even better job, you should take even a step further back and look not just at single humans and their micro niches. You would want to look at bigger populations and larger groups of human beings and how they interact with artifacts and with each other. It's a more sociological I guess maybe what I'm trying to say here is the distinction between psychology and sociology. Psychology tends to look at the individual, sociology at groups. I tend to be influenced by psychology, and I look at the individual primarily, also a little bit at groups, but only small groups. But if you're a sociologist or an anthropologist, you look at the bigger group and how bigger groups use artifacts and monuments and the cultural practices associated with monuments. So I take your point, it's a valid point. My answer is that I think it's a matter of perspective. I think my view, my lens, my focus is just single human beings and the way they interact with many artifacts, not just one, a whole variety of them. But there's like sociology of cognitive science that is super important as well. And so it's just, I don't know, I think they complement each other. So some people look at single humans and artifacts and other people look at groups. I think, yeah, they maybe should talk more to each other. That's a good point, I think. But I think both are kind of equally valid or important views to take when you want to better understand the relation between humans and the environment. You made a very good point. So I use the word memory ecology, and I specifically in this paper define memory ecology as all the artifacts that are related to my autobiographical memory, right? So memories of my past, the things that I've eaten, experienced when I graduated, etc., right? But that is only one kind of memory. We have semantic memory as well, memory about facts, like when I don't know, when the Second World War ended, when, I don't know, what the capital of Russia is, the capital of Australia is, those kinds of things. That is also memory. And then we have what you say, imagination ecology. I think that's a good one. I think that's true. I think we use objects in our environments to help us imagine. So Andy Clark has an example of a painter who has an empty canvas and starts painting, but the painter doesn't have a picture of the painting in his or her mind. The painter starts painting and something happens on the canvas and you respond to it. And there's this interaction between you and the painting that kind of emerges out of nothing. And so, yes, I think often we use artifacts for imagination purposes as well, and for navigation purposes and for calculation purposes. So we have all kinds of cognitive capacities, and there's a set of categories of artifacts that we use to help us perform those cognitive tasks. So you could make finer grade distinctions: memory ecology, imagination ecology, navigation ecology, mathematical ecology. And then my focus has been the narrative ecology, right? The environments, the things in our environments that we use to help us remember a personal past. I think the bigger picture should be cognitive ecology, right? That is every object and person in my environment that is related to all my cognitive processes, including memory, imagination, calculation, language, etc., etc. And then you can identify finer grade categories within that, kinds of cognitive capacities that artifacts extend. It's a good point. So in a sense, my focus is very narrow, right? I just look at autobiographical memory and the environments, but there are other cognitive capacities that we also that also relates to the environment. I hope I have some time left. One point is really interesting, and other people have pointed that out too, because there's different kinds of evocative objects, right? So when I look at a picture of a holiday that I went to on Bali, say 5 years ago, that picture has a very strong isomorphism with the original event, but the picture is almost identical to the actual scene, right? So it's looks like, right? So Charles Peirce, American pragmatist, would say it's an icon. So you mentioned linguistic inscriptions, right? So I might write something in my diary, so I might read that back in 5 days or 5 years, and the language triggers the memory. But sometimes, and it's because that is informational, right? So language and photos are kind of external representations. But I might also go to Bali, go to the beach, and I find a shell there, and I put it in my pocket, bring it home, and the shell becomes a souvenir or kind of a memento for me to trigger memories of my holiday. But the shell doesn't look like the scene in Bali, right? So I might compare the picture that actually looks like the things in the scene versus a shell that doesn't look like anything, right? But it's just, there is an accidental association made between that object and my memory. So the properties of the evocative objects are different. Sometimes they're representational, and sometimes they're non-representational, right? So a picture or a linguistic sentence is representational. The shell or the chair might remind me of the last film I saw when I sat in that chair, right? The chair doesn't look like the film that I saw, but it still triggers that memory. And so there's basically two kinds of ways that evocative objects can trigger memories, either by having representational properties, by being a picture or being a linguistic description, or by being completely arbitrary and having nothing to do really with the memory. It's just the accidental association that you have made in your mind that makes the artifact trigger the memory. So this is a distinction that I do mention in a paper in philosophical studies, I think. So if this is something that you find interesting, the difference between representational and non-representational evocative objects, there's a section on that in a paper I published a couple of years ago in Phil Studies. Because it's a good point, and it's an important thing to keep in mind, I think, when you want to better understand the relation between us and evocative objects. I think that might have been 5 minutes. I don't know exactly.
Yeah, that's great.
Probably, yeah, maybe more even. Sorry about that. I tend to do that.
It's okay. It's okay. Thank you, Richard. We have one more talk, one more short report. Okay, please, I give the floor for Dr. Yelena Trufanova. Please, Yelena, you have 10 minutes.
Just a moment, I'll try to share my presentation as well. So do you see the presentation?
Yeah.
It's okay, I'll start. Just a moment. Okay. So this is just a brief information about me so that Richard would know from where I go approaching his talk. And I would like to thank Richard for this very interesting paper. And actually I have comments for much more than 10 minutes, but I have to stick to the time given to me. So I'll stick to the points that were the most provoking for thought at this moment of time. First of all, I would like to say that I feel that the research of memory, both individual and collective, is one of the crucial subjects that needs an extensive research and exactly in the line that Richard touches in the line of research in the context of extended use of the new digital technologies in our everyday lives. And I would like to point out that I also share the, so to say, the sympathy for the narrative approach to the personal identity and episodic memory construction. And I feel like cognitive niche theory is a very promising approach at this point. So my talk is not an opposing talk to Professor Heersmink ideas, but I would like to point some difficulties that I see in the buildup of memory ecology that was suggested. So when we speak about memory ecology, according to Richard, it consists of evocative objects and transactive memory partners that surround the person. Of course, we can all agree that since humans started to write things down on paper, on whatever, our memory becomes distributed and it transcends our skulls and goes into the world. And it is without doubt that we can express episodic memories via narratives, that certain objects stimulate our memories, memory processes, and that our transactive memory partners can help us recall some events we took part in or some facts of our biographies. But it seems to me that there is an important point that the elements of memory ecology, so the one who is the center of these memories, the owner of the memories, and the elements of memory ecology should be regarded as highly, so to say, disproportionate. So, first of all, when we speak about evocative objects, in this case, the evocative objects themselves as the objects are useless as memory vessels without the memory, without the memories that are in our heads, without the embodied mind that reaches out to them. For example, when I'm dead, this I don't know, this cup, for example, that reminds me of my grandma, won't retain any memory of my grandma that it has awoken in me, and it will not be passed. It can be passed to my children, grandchildren, but will fade away eventually. So the evocative objects can be seen just triggers for my memories, but they are meaningless without the memory owner. So the memory does not rest within the object. On the other hand, I can remember my grandma with or without the evocative objects. We talked about it that, for example, I can toss away a picture of my ex-boyfriend in an attempt to forget about the pain our breakup has caused me, but it can help only to a certain degree. It won't kill the memory on the whole. Thus, the evocative objects do play a part in the memory processes, but the role is secondary to my mind. Whether the evocative object exists or not, it doesn't necessarily mean if certain memory remains in my mind or not. For example, even if the cup in question was thrown away, I can still hold in my memory both the memory of this cup and the memory of my grandma. Evocative objects are indeed scaffolds or triggers for our memories, but it doesn't necessarily mean that our memories essentially need them. Another thing about evocative objects that some of them can be woven into the narrative recollection. For example, I can tell the story of how my grandma used to love this cup and so on. But there are other objects and phenomena that can trigger my memories without me being able to narratively explain the link between the trigger and the recollection. I can share from my personal experience, there is a certain memory trigger that I get from a certain smell in nature that I call for myself a fresh snow smell. This smell always triggers the memory of the country house of my childhood. But there is no particular event or no particular winter story that I can link together. So I have absolutely no idea why this triggering appears, why this happens. Many objects and phenomena of the outside world spontaneously trigger our memories without me being able to weave them into my personal narratives, for me being able to get them into the structure of my narrative identity. There is, of course, a different matter with transactive memory partners. Transactive memory partners, we can actively ask them to recall things together, share our recollections, remind each other on certain things, but memories experienced together are not necessarily the same memories. We already talked about it. Richard already told about how my memory partner can contaminate my memory with false memories, right? But it's not also the point of the false memories. For example, I think anyone can recall from their own experience a rather embarrassing situation when you recall some event together with your memory partner, and your partner sees this event as a happy one, but you remember being bored and tired, and that's your feet hurt and so on. And so you remember the same event very differently. So it's not only the matter of emotions or that color, so to say, color memories, but it's also the problem of different knowledge of the same situation that each of us had. So our memories with the transactive memory partners do indeed complement each other, but they're essentially different memories of the same event. Another moment that is, I think, one of the most interesting ones in nowadays situation, especially at this point when we are all more or less on lockdown, whether official or not, and we live in the digital world. So this is the question of digital memories and digital memory logs. Richard talked about it, about live logging. So I feel that although we tend to see the memory logs as objective instruments that, so to say, objective, that capture everyday moments of our lives exactly as they were, not as the biased brains that we all have, and they record each moment. But the question is, should we call these digital objects a part of our memory, and do we really need them in a memory ecology? Because the amount of the digital information that we get via live logging, for example, is overwhelming, and it exceeds human capacity to process this information. What is more important, most of this information is useless, and it will never make it to our meaningful narratives. We won't need them if we want to talk about who we are. I liked the picture that you showed about the day of a person where there is computer screen, and so on.
Right.
Yeah, I guess it's quite the same for most of the people here. So the same picture of everyday life, but it's not what makes meaningful narratives, life narratives. And the most important thing is what information we ourselves find useful and meaningful. And it's exactly what we remember and what we forget that shapes us as persons, but not each and every step, each and every moment, each and every view that we see walking across the street, etc. So what live logging tries to accomplish, it's a certain philosophy, it's absolute memory of every moment of our life. I feel it's either useless unless there is indeed a problem of medical problem of memory. Yeah? But it's also dangerous because overwhelming amounts of information are impossible for our minds to deal with. And we get lost and disoriented and lose the sense of who we are. And there is also another question that is connected to the digital memories. It's the question of the right to oblivion. I do not speak here of the right to be forgotten, which has been recently discussed in the context of violation of private data, which is also a very important question. I'm speaking of the person's right not only to have memories, but also to forget something. Because if we remembered all the pain of the traumatic experience, we would not be able to carry on. If we remembered all the anger we ever felt toward anybody, we wouldn't be able to forgive. When we learn from our mistakes, it's okay, it's good, but we were constantly reminded of these mistakes. We would be afraid to make another one, and we would not improve. So oblivion of certain things is thus as important as memory and for our personal development. And if our whole lives were digitally recorded, we lose this chance to forget, and some things just need to be forgotten. I conclude that memory as cognition overall can indeed be distributed, and objected phenomena of the outer world, digital data, as well as other persons, allow us to remember our own personal past in a different manner. But I'm not sure that with the help of these evocative objects or memory partners, our memories indeed become more reliable and more detailed. I'm not sure this is always the case. For example, when we use certain objects to extend our memories, so diaries, notebooks that are mostly in digital form now, we delegate the task of remembering to external objects. For example, just so that we can have more space for our own more meaningful and personal memories. For example, I hardly ever remember now birth dates of most of my friends and colleagues, relying on the smartphone and social networks to remind me of them. And there are lots of such technical details that we, of our memory, that we outsource like that. But I feel that the personal memories, those that are meaningful to our personal identity narratives, are much less dependent on the outer objects. And even when the memory ecology components are inaccessible, these meaningful memories remain more or less intact. So once again, I see that the evocative memories, evocative objects and transactive memory partners can be seen more like triggers than like equal partners in this distributed system. And overall, the role of memory ecology components depends on the type of memories in question. Some memories are really object dependent. If I don't see some picture, I will never remember I met some person, for example. But others will exist all the same with or without this scaffolding. So I stop here, and once again, thank you, Richard, for your very interesting paper, both your papers that were sent actually, and I would like to read more of your work.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Elena. Thank you for your bright presentation. So, Richard, you have a possibility to respond.
Again, there's a lot there. It was a very rich, very rich commentary. There's a lot to think about, I have to say. So thanks, Elena, for that. Very perceptive, very you get a very analytic eye in reading literature and papers. Okay, I made lots of notes, being an extended mind theorist myself. First, it was a kind of a common theme, I think, in some of your points, is that the memory isn't actually in the artifact. The artifact merely triggers a memory that is already just in the brain. So you mentioned the coffee cup of your grandma. And so the memory, you look at the coffee cup and it triggers something, right? So the memory is stored in the brain. It's the coffee cup is a mere cue. And I think that makes sense. I think that's true. I wouldn't have any objections to that, but I think that happens only in certain artifacts. I think in some cases, the artifact contributes more actively to constructing the memory. So for example, when I tried to remember the holiday on Bali 5 years ago, just by relying on my biological memory, some things may come to mind. I might remember what the beach looked like and the cabin that I was in, but it's very dim and most of the information has decayed. But when I look at the picture, I can use that information in the photo and the information in my biological memory trace and integrate that information into consciousness to have a fuller memory. And in such cases, when we depend more on the artifact in order to be able not just to trigger the memory, but actually construct the memory by integrating information in the artifact and in the brain, then I think it's a more obvious example of maybe extended mind cases or proper distributed cognition theory. So I think so some components of my memory ecology merely trigger memories. That's perfectly fine. I totally agree with you there. But other objects play a much more active role in constructing the memory. And that has to do with the nature of the object, the information it contains, with the memory, right? Because the older the memory is, the more likely it is that the memory trace is decayed. That's kind of just a property of biological memory. Kind of the information slowly goes away. That's, unfortunately what happens in the brain. So I didn't take it I agree with you there. It's a good point you bring up. So some components, elements in a memory ecology / cognitive niche are triggers, whereas others, I think, are properly conceived of as cases of extended minds and distributed cognitive systems. That's one point that I want to. I can agree with you mostly there. Yeah, editing only. So what I note here, editing only gets you so far, right? So throwing away the picture of your ex-boyfriend or girlfriend, yeah, you might not be reminded, but unfortunately the memory is still in the brain, and yeah, the picture might be gone, but unfortunately the memory is still there. And that's true. I don't have any smart answer or reply. I think that's totally true. There's nothing that's consistent with how I think about narrative identity and how it interacts with the environment. That's true. The memory is still there, although over time, I think it might be the case that you forget most of it. It becomes less traumatic and less painful when time passes, right? So that's also a property of biological memory. Yeah, memory is still in the head. Yeah. Oh, right. This one, the smell, when the smell triggers a memory which is unrelated to the event, right? So you smell snow of some kind, and all of a sudden a memory comes into your consciousness. There's nothing to do with snow, right? And so there's a link between a sensory input, a smell in this case, and a memory, and the link is not clear. I don't know what to say. Maybe it's because the link has been made subconsciously. And so the link has been made in your past a long time ago, and you remember exactly how that happened. Maybe you were in your childhood amnesia, so before 10 years old, or maybe you were in your teens, and you're not quite sure how it is that the link is made, but the link might be there, but it's just not accessible to you with consciousness. But consciousness doesn't have access to everything in the brain, right? Consciousness only can have access to certain things. There, I think maybe in such cases, I don't know, my initial reply would be, it's because you don't know how the link was made. But you're right, though, sometimes an object triggers a memory and you have no idea why. Or a song, for example, you put up, you sit in your car, you drive around and a song comes to mind, and some memory comes to mind that you're kind of surprised about, like, why do I remember this? I have no idea. Did I listen to that song while I was doing this activity? I don't know. Maybe that just happens because sometimes these links are made outside conscious awareness. Perhaps, I don't know, maybe there might be other explanations, but that would be my initial guess. Yeah, memory partners remember events differently. That's totally true. And that's an interesting point, though, because the holiday that I mentioned a bunch of times to Bali, I remember that as very positive. My wife hated it. And so, and we were always together, like every single second. We did every task together, and I liked most of it, and she didn't. And when we then talk about it now, I feel like her view maybe contaminates the way I remember it. So, and that's more of a social property of memory. When your transactive memory partner has a different view on the event, it does contaminate the way you remember your past as well. That's true. I think I'm not sure if that's necessarily a problem for my view on the narrative self. It's just kind of a feature, I guess, of social memory where, yeah, you are influenced by the views and the memories of your partner, and that's true. Although I am aware of it, and she's aware of it as well. So we are aware when we do reminisce about our shared experience in the past. We are aware of the fact. So it's not completely something that we're not aware of. It is something that you can work with and can shape a little bit. Okay, moving on. Next point. Life logs. Yes, there's too much information in them, basically, right? So you will have, there's the picture that I showed, the screenshot, it has 50 pictures of a computer screen. It's totally, you don't need that, right? You just need one picture, basically. And that's true. I think that's a very good point. You get an enormous information overload, and as a result of it, you don't use your life log anymore. I've been reading that in the literature. There's so much information there. You don't know where to start anymore, and you open it up and you get distracted, and and it doesn't work that well. And so this is why it's important, I think, that you should edit your memory ecology in such a way that it works for you. that you should have a very perhaps a minimal amount of photos and descriptions in your life log that only support the memories that you think are important, right? Because human life, we have millions of experiences in our life, but most of them are boring, mundane, repetitive. You don't want to remember them. They don't play an important role in your narrative, but some are important. Holidays, graduation ceremonies, concerts, dinners with friends, good experiences, nice holidays with your partner, not all. And so you would want to design your memory ecology such that those pictures, souvenirs, descriptions support memories that you find are important. That's the solution, I think. And I'm not here to sell live logging. I don't live log myself, although I have a phone which has hundreds of photos in it, which is kind of like live logging. It's not called live logging, but everybody has photos and videos and your inbox and your messages. This is kind of like my live log, but the trick is to not be overwhelmed with the information and delete stuff that you don't need, right? In this sense, I did agree with Mary Kondo. Don't have too much evocative objects, because you lose interest in them and you run the risk of not using them at all. One thing I can say here, I've been reading a lot of, of course I forgot his name, ironically. He's a professor in computer science. He's the founding father of live logging. Gordon Bell. He works at Microsoft and at a university as well. And he wrote a book called Total Recall, and he writes about his life log and his experiences. And he says that, well, why did I start life logging? Well, I was 60, 70 years old. I noticed that my biological memory was fading. I lost my memories. This is a common thing to happen. I didn't want that to happen. I felt like my identity was slipping away from me. And so what he did is he made a very extensive life log with pictures and descriptions and souvenirs, and because he wanted to preserve his identity, right? And again, this is a personal thing. Some people find forgetting a very normal aspect of growing older, right? That's totally normal. It is normal, but some people find that problematic, or they don't want that to happen. And if that's the case, you can support your fading memories with life logging technology. Certainly when you have Alzheimer's or dementia, having a life log turns out to be very helpful, right? So at the end of the day, you have all these pictures on your computer, and reviewing them helps you consolidate that information in the brain in a way that's not possible if you don't have a life log. So it depends on the person, right? So I think, yes, if you have Alzheimer's, you might want to have a life log with a lot of information. If you're young and healthy, you might want to have a life log with very selective information that only supports memories that are important to you. Right to forget. Yeah, when you mentioned that, it is an important concept. I totally agree with you. What came to mind is the film Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind. I'm not sure if you've seen that, which is about a romantic couple that have a relationship. The relationship fails and they remove their memories. That's a sci-fi film. They go to this neurologist. They go into this brain scanner. The memories are removed from their brain because they don't want to be reminded of their failed relationship. So it's kind of like not editing your memory ecology by throwing away pictures. It's actually removing the memory from your brain, hypothetically. And that is kind of an extreme version of the right to forget, right? You would want to have autonomy over the kinds of things that you remember, right? So sometimes here, my answer, it's a very complex problem, actually. I guess in a way, we would want to own up to events in our past that are unpleasant. I think it's existentially inauthentic if you just delete memories from your brain or from your memory ecology such that you can only have happy moments. Kind of like people's Facebook profile, right? Only pictures of holidays and fancy dinner parties, right? It's not representative for human life. We have lots of miserable experiences, and they should be part of the narrative too. So here with the right to forget, yes, if the event is very traumatic, if it causes PTSD, yes, you would want to try to get rid of the memory, of course. But most of the time, I think it's more authentic to try to incorporate a painful memory in the narrative and try to make sense of it and try to process it and to just accept that life isn't always positive, I guess. And then a problem, one final thing. here, if I may, I think I might have some time, is that it's not always a good thing to rely on evocative objects, right? So because we delegate remembering to the object, we tend to not put as much effort into trying to store the information in the brain. There's a study that you might have heard of from Linda Henkel, who had a group of students, two groups of students. One group both had to walk through a museum. One group was given a photo camera, had to take pictures of the objects in the museum. The other group was not given a camera. And then later, the memories of those objects were tested. And it turns out if you are a person who takes pictures of objects, you have less detailed memories in your brain of the objects, which makes sense. I think you probably have all had this when you're on holiday and you take way too many photos. And because you take photos, it interferes with your biological memory. And so the lesson here is don't always use your phone to make memories, to make photos. Rely on your biological perceptual system if you want to have good memory, right? That's the lesson there, I guess. And I kind of agree with that. I've kind of written a bunch of papers on the ethics of memory technologies, that we should at least be aware of phenomena like this, right? It's kind of, I guess, normal, but whatever that precisely means. It happens to all of us, but don't overdo it, right? Don't only take pictures the whole time. Have a healthy mix of, okay, I take pictures of some things, but not of others, so that you've kind of a mixture of different memories there. And then one final point, if I may, the narrative remains intact without the ecology. And that's a very good point, actually. But I'm not sure if it's the exact same narrative. So I've talked and written about, I've used as an example, Robinson Crusoe, who was ashore on an island, and he loses all his evocative objects. He loses all transactive memory partners. He's there alone. There's nothing there that triggers memories of his past. But he still has a narrative, right? So if he's like lying on the beach alone at night, he thinks through his past and he has all kinds of memories. So the narrative is there. That's true, I think. But what's also true is that it turns out that for the vast majority of human beings, certainly in the 21st century, we are surrounded with digital technologies, with souvenirs, with books, with CDs and artworks. We tend to just surround ourselves with evocative. That's what humans do, I think. Not all of us, like there's a handful of exceptions here and there, but it is just a property of human beings, I think, that we do rely on artifacts and other people to help us remember our past. We don't have to. We can't just rely on biological memory, and sometimes we do, but it just turns out as a contingent matter of fact in the 21st century, high-tech environment, everybody has social media and cameras on the phone and makes notes, and phone numbers are stored on your phone. And so it doesn't have to be that way. So I'm not saying that distributed narrative selfhood is a necessary property or a defining property of narrative identity. Narratives exist without artifacts. That's true, but it just happens to be the case that for us, the human condition is such that we do, most of us extend our memories and narrative identity. Okay, I think I'll stop here. I think I've talked enough now. Thank you. Thank you again. It was a very perceptive comment, and also Sergi's comment is really good. There's a lot of things I need to think about now before I'm going to write my next papers. Yes.
Okay, thank you, Richard. And now we are moving to the conclusive stage of our discussion. So we have some time for comments, for some critical remarks. So if you don't mind, I will start. For me, the ecological metaphor of niche construction is very fruitful. So I would try to expand it in a similar way as Sergey did, but I think I can cope with individual perspective. So Richard, I think in your papers you mention only one ecological role of artifacts and our narrative partners. it is ecological role of symbionts. But as Sergey mentioned, yeah, there are also predators and parasites that that are meaningful for our micro narrative niche. So speaking about parasites, I can use the example of data collection, big data collection. So, for example, my Google queries in Google Scholar, for example, they are created. They're not created intentionally like evocative objects, but when I see the history of my queries, yes, I can make my autobiographical biographical narrative or more detailed. So they scaffold my narrative identity in a significant way, but they're also collected and used in a more intensive manner by my provider, by Alphabet company, by Google. And so that is maybe that could be an example of maybe not parasite, but another ecological role of counteragent in my narrative niche, in my memory ecology. So I created, I can use it as a memory object, but it is used more intensively used by some other agent. And so I think the point is more in maybe intentionality of what do I create as evocative object now, or what is created as a part of everyday life that I don't even have in mind that I create as a time scaffolding my autobiographical narrative. That is the one point of making the metaphor more broad. But when I start to think about the broadening of this metaphor, I realized that maybe its usefulness can turn to its weak point, because I don't know, you maybe know the works of Philippe Petit, prominent political philosopher. He also works in social ontology, and he says that organizations, institutions are individuals because they produce a single autobiographical narrative. And this point is very popular among people who are developing narrative identity criteria. They speak, yeah, we are like institutions. And so we can inverse this metaphor. I think that your points can be interpreted as also in the line of this metaphor, but in inverse way, vice versa. So not institutions, not the collection of agents and objects are individuals, but individuals are their collection of objects and other agents. So, but that can be the weak point for me is that we can develop it in a circle way. So we can circle among individual perspective and assemblage perspective, the collection of objects and agents perspective. And so we can stop in a single moment to develop the concrete perspective to claim something about what we want to say. So my conclusion is, the metaphor is very fruitful, and I would like maybe to develop in a way like searching the parasites or predators of our narrative niche. But I'm fear that we can have a circle of our thoughts among institution, organization, group, and so on, and individual perspective, and maybe if you understand what I'm trying to say, maybe you have some thoughts about where we should stop this circle of metaphors, and say, okay, we're developing individual perspective, individual ecology, because ecology, yes, it's more about ecosystem, not about single organism. So thank you for your, maybe you have something to respond.
I have, it's a lot, every comment is a lot, I was bombarded with a lot of information here. Right, so first point is, makes a lot of sense, I think. So you talked about predators and parasites, and it would be naive to think that my memory ecology is only accessible to me, right? That's not the case. That might have been the case in the 20th century, but my memory ecology was a paper-based photo album and a journal with written language, right? All these objects in your living room. 21st century, social media, Google, they collect a lot of information about your activities, right? And that's, I haven't said this yet, but I've been writing a book on the distributed narrative self for Oxford University Press. It's finished, sort of, and I got a chapter in the book on exactly this. And so for my own research, so Facebook and Google allow you to download all the information that they have collected about you. So Facebook, there's a link somewhere buried away in the terms and conditions for both Facebook and Google. You can click on it and they will send you everything they have collected about you. And so I've had a Google, so if you have a Gmail profile, you have a Google profile and Google collects everything about you. And I've had a Gmail for 15 years. And so they've sent me 150 gigabytes of information about my last 15 years, every location where I have been in the last 15 years, with a lot of detail, with all the times is there, every search term, every link that I've clicked, everything that I've ever done on the internet, it's all there, and it's scary, right? So Google knows more about me than I know about myself, which is kind of strange when you think about it. And Facebook is the exact same thing. So Facebook will send you all the information that they've collected about you. And there's too much there, right? And this kind of goes back to Elena's point as well, I think, that there's just too much information in live logs, which is true. And if you think that's a problem, you should try to go to Google and ask them to send them your information. Then it will take you years to sift through it. It's overwhelming. It's just too much there. And another point, that information, they collect that information for a reason, of course, right? It's not that they can send it to you. They use that to build a profile of you, so they know where you are at certain times, what your preferences are, what you like to eat, so they can send you advertisements, targeted advertisements that will convince you to buy products that you don't really need. It's basically capitalism, basically. It's a terrible, terrible thing. So your memory ecology is a very rich resource for big tech companies, right? And it's not always used in a beneficial way. Totally agree. It's a good point. I think more people should be aware of that. Yeah, the other point was Philip Petit. He's an Australian philosopher, I think. I've met him a few times actually here years ago, actually, when I was still a PhD student. But there, I wasn't quite sure. So my focus is on the individual and the narrative of the individual, but collections of groups, like a company or a sports team, or maybe a country as a group also has a narrative. I think that's what I got. So you got the individual versus the collective. Basically, individuals have narratives, collectives have too. but as individuals, you're part of collectives, right? So you can't escape being part of some collective at least. And so those things interact with each other. I think that's what you said, right? So my personal narrative interacts in different kinds of ways with the narratives of the collectives that I'm part of, right? I'm part of a group of philosophers, I guess. I'm Australian now. And you asked, where does it stop? Why? Because the interaction goes on and on and on. I'm not sure if it has to stop. I think that's just something that we should study, probably, how it exactly individual narratives and the narratives of the collectives that individuals are part of. I'm not quite sure. I mean, it's just this topic that I guess we should better understand by drawing on social ontology. And I've recently become interested in collective memory. There's a very rich tradition in sociology and anthropology that talks about collective memories, memories that we all share, basically, not memories about what I have done, but memories about what happened to my country or my soccer team or my university or my village, right? So there's a lot more to study, I think. I'm just getting started, I feel, about memory and collective memory and artifacts. I'm not sure if that quite answers your question, but
yes. Thank you, Richard. Yeah, I think we can move to another comments. So, please, yeah, Olga, please.
Yes. I think that Richard's talk raises a very important issue, so the epistemology of memory, and we can talk about distributed memory and distributed identity, but at the same time, what do we do with the memory that cannot be distributed and cannot be archived? And I'd like to touch on the problem of limit experience. If we remember Paul Ricoeur, he says that a witness asserts his identity as a witness in several ways. He states, I was there, then he adds, believe me, and then he adds, if you don't believe me, ask someone else. And the witness must reproduce the testimony in time. And this act shows the credibility of the evidence and at the same time the authenticity of the witness identity. But what happens to testimony when we talk about the limit experience? Ricoeur speaks of the crisis of testimony by recalling the experience of the Holocaust, which manifests itself in the impossibility of archiving and expressing it. And this is an experience that has nothing to do with the experience of the average person. The limit experience cannot be expressed in such a way as to ensure adequate understanding, and the testimony must be adapted to the ordinary level of perception, and it must be free of the sense of horror. But this characteristic does not apply for the testimony, for instance, for the testimony of the victims of concentration camps, for the testimony of the victims of the abuse, and the witness feels a sense of shame. The witness cannot say about his experience. For instance, Auschwitz prisoner Primo Levi asked the question, how to tell about your own death. And I think that we must think, should this memory be only personal, or should we find ways to express it, to distribute it? Should we translate experience into narrative, or on the contrary, silence would be more appropriate here? And it is the question for Richard, and maybe my conclusion, my add that I had to this discussion.
Right, thank you. Good point. This is more kind of the kind of the interaction, I think, between personal and collective memory, having to do with the epistemology of memory. Like, okay, witness testimony. So first I thought when you started your comment, I thought when you said witness testimony, that it was about crime scenes. Like this is, you see this in films in the United States, right? You observe a crime, you saw the person, and then, okay, you have to make a drawing, or 5 people are put on a line, you have to pick the person who did the crime, which is notoriously unreliable because of the unreliability of memory, right? So we often pick the wrong person in a crime scene because of the unreliability of memory. But then you went on to talking about Auschwitz and personal experience of people having in concentration camps. And that's not the kind of thing that you distribute, that memories of your experiences there, because it's very traumatizing, right? If you've been a victim of Nazi Germany, or if you are another type of concentration camp, that is very hard to talk about. You don't have pictures of it. You don't want to have pictures of it because you don't want to be reminded of it. I think it kind of ties in a little bit about editing. And it has to do with shame as well. So this is one of the worst things that can happen to you, I think, as a person, is to be in a concentration camp. So you really don't want to talk about it. But I think, and this depends on the individual. So I think there's a lot of individual differences. Some people want to talk about it. They might have a diary when they were in Auschwitz, and they might read their diary later or something, and they might have pictures or pictures taken by others, and they want to, because it might have a healing effect. So, and others might not be, I think, right? So it depends on a person. So I don't really have much to say about there, but as a culture, as a community, we should remember Auschwitz, I think, right? So on a collective level, Auschwitz is still there, I think, the buildings of Auschwitz and of many other concentration camps. So I'm from the Netherlands originally. There were concentration camps there too, and they're still there, for the very reason that because we want to, well, we should be reminded of the atrocities of war, right? In order to prevent them from happening again, right? So it's a good thing, I guess, to be reminded on a collective level, such that we don't have, and that's why I think war monuments exist. So here, very close to where I live, there's the Shrine of Remembrance, which is a very big building built to remember all the wars that Australia has fought in. And on a collective level, that's very important. It's broadcasted on TV. There are all kinds of soldiers there. It's kind of a big thing. And that's how we as a culture collectively remember things like war. So how individuals can remember their experiences in whatever works for them, I think, depending on the kind of person you are, depending on what happened to you, that's a personal, private matter, I think. But how we as a culture commemorate and remember war is kind of institutionalized, right? It's done in a particular way, and we talk about particular events during kind of sessions at monuments and so on. So I'm not quite sure if I answered your question. It was more a comment, I think, or an observation, or. Sorry, I'm asking, was it a question? Or was it more like a comment you had, or observation, or statement, or?
Olga, please.
Yes, I asked if we should we find ways to express memory, or should we translate experience into narrative, or on the contrary, we must have silence and appropriate this experience in silence, because we cannot understand this experience we didn't experience. Don't have such experience.
I think this is more a question of a psychiatric/psychological nature, how victims of trauma and war should remember events, whether they should try to put it away and never think about it again, or whether they should incorporate it in their narrative and somehow try to make sense of it. Yeah, so remember, maybe I said at some point that it's inauthentic not to remember the past, right? So with that film, Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind, a couple deletes the memory. That's kind of inauthentic. I think that's fair enough. That seems inauthentic, but with something like war and trauma and concentration camps, that is so horrible. I think I think it might be a good strategy not to make that part of your narrative and try to suppress it as much as you can, I guess. I don't know if that's a good answer. It depends on the person, I think. Whatever works for the particular person, I guess. But I can certainly understand that people would not want to be reminded of those events and try to shut it away, shut it off from their past and from their memory. But...
Thanks.
Okay, thank you, Richard. We have time for one short comment if anyone wants to make it. Okay, Sergey, please. Switch on the microphone.
I'm just back to my remark on metaphoric nature. Because I think that the grounding role of the metaphors in our knowledge construction is so basic that it often skips reflection, our reflection. That's why I draw your attention to this metaphor, because what does interest me, what does this metaphor smuggles across disciplinary border when we borrow. So this needs reflection precisely. It might be something that we don't need.
That's a good point.
When we
That's
borrow.
a good, yeah. So you think you borrow a helpful concept, you take it from biology, use it in philosophy and anthropology, but you might accidentally also insert some of the properties of the metaphor that aren't beneficial for you.
Skipping reflection, even. Because the level is so basic that we don't sometimes use it precisely.
This would require more knowledge of ecology as it is used in biology, right? So you would want to see, okay, what does the concept, what kind of role does it play in their theory? What does it do for them? What does it explain?
All our associations with parasites and etc.
Yeah, right. Yes, thank you, sir. That's a good metaphor. That makes sense because it is kind of parasitic, right? So it's kind of like the same role. Google is the parasite of the technological world. It makes sense, I guess. And so there might be other concepts in ecology that we can transfer across disciplinary boundaries, as you just say. I would have to read more on ecology, basically. My source is a textbook from Paul Griffiths and Kim Sterelny. They wrote an introduction to philosophy and biology. The book is called Sex and Death, and there's a whole chapter on ecology there. It's helpful, it's good, it's very good stuff. I'll have another look at that. The book is here somewhere, I think, on my shelf, maybe even. All right, thanks. That's a good comment. I'll think about that. Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Richard. So I think we have done a good job. I think everyone enjoyed the conversation. So thank you, Richard, for taking part, for being here for more than 2 hours. So thank you for all participants for your contribution to our talk. So thanks a lot. I think we will keep in touch, and maybe in half a year we will make another seminar about maybe we will have some other ideas. Maybe we will develop what we mentioned today. And yes, thank you all, and goodbye.
Yeah, I want to thank also, if I can, so like the last, thanks everybody. It's much appreciated. 2.5 hours on a Wednesday evening talking about memory ecologies and cognition. That's amazing. Thanks everybody for all your very perceptive questions and comments. I've learned a lot. I have to go over my notes again tomorrow with a fresh mind and see if I can insert some of it, because I'm still going to work on the revisions of the book. So I got back the revisions from the reviewers, and I need to submit a new version in December. So there's still room for me to insert more and more ideas in the book. So I'll certainly keep all of this in mind for that. Thank you very much for that.
Thank you.
Thank you
for your talk.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Have a nice day.
Thank
Yeah.
you.
Good night.
And good luck.
Yeah.